Hi, and welcome to Parashat Pinchas. And here in this parasha, we're going to explore an incredible situation where Pinchas takes his initiative and takes a spear and kills point blank Zimri, the head of the priests of Shimon, and Cosby, the Midianite woman that he was messing around with in front of the whole Kahal. And as a result of that, he gets awarded by God a covenant of peace. How does slaying get you a covenant of peace? We're going to explore that. And also, at the end of the parasha, as Moshe approaches his final moments, he's asked to come up and look at the land and just get ready to hand over to Yeshua. It's a very emotional moment. And these two incidents actually give us a lot of insights into the whole notion of the body and soul. Which is a subject that I absolutely love. So here we go. And the first thing the Al-Sheikh says is that when you do a mitzvah, you're not only accumulating merits, you're also actually changing your personality. You're changing your essence as a result of those mitzvot. And he gives some beautiful examples of this. In Makot 23, we are told that there are 248 positive mitzvot, and these relate to the 248 limbs that we have in our bodies. And so if every time we do mitzvah, we actually are elevating the body, elevating that particular part of the body to a holier component. And this idea is reflected in the actual prayer that we say before consuming anything. Asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. You, God, who have made us holy as a result of your commandments. And so God gives us many commandments in order to enable us to raise up the spiritual ladder and become more holy. And as we become holier, we get closer to Hashem. And in this parasha, we see that the consequence of these mitzvot actually changes the person physically, as we'll see with both Moshe and Pinchas. But first, let's understand the situation with Pinchas. Pinchas actually should have been a Kohen because he's the son of Eleazar, who's the son of Aaron a Kohen. But the problem is that he was born before Eleazar was made a Kohen. And the hereditary line of Kohenut only happens from the person who was Kohen at the beginning. Because Pinchas was born before Eleazar became a Kohen, Pinchas could not become a Kohen. Only the children who were born after Eliezer was a Kohen would become a Kohen. And so he kind of missed out. It's kind of like Jacob being born second. What can you do? Do you resign to the victimhood of that situation, or do you change it? And in both cases, they changed it. But Pinchas had to do something very courageous in order to change his whole nature. The whole incident of killing the leader of the Shimonites, who was parading in front of Moshe and the elders with this harlotry, was a life-threatening move by Pinchas, because remember that his cousin Hur, the son of Miriam, died in very similar circumstances in the incident of the golden calf, when he tried to stop the Jewish people making that sin. He was actually killed by them. So it was extremely likely that Pinchas himself would be killed. And yet he took matters into his hands. And we'll explain in a minute why. And let's look at the Pasuk. It's chapter 25, verse 7. Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the Kohen, saw, and he stood up amidst the assembly and took a spear in his hand. And he followed the Israel man into the tent and pierced both of them, the Israeli man and the woman, into her stomach. And the plague was halted from upon the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague was 24,000. And what is it that Pinchas saw? The Al-Sheikh has a really alternative view of this. He says that what he saw was that he was the grandson of Aaron a Kohen, and yet he was not a Kohen. And so he felt that he needed to do something heroic in order to earn the right to become a Kohen. And so Pinchas decided to take his life into his hand and armed with the mitzvot to do this deed. And what mitzvot was he armed with? Firstly, it's interesting that the Al-Sheikh mentions that the spears, the word for spear in Hebrew is romach. And the gematria of Romach is 248, which is the very number of the mitzvah that we mentioned earlier. So not only did he take that into his hand, but 248 is also the gematria of Avram, and he took the zealousness of Abraham with him into this deed. This whole idea of Avram confronting Nimrod and being thrown into the furnace as a result of this zealousness towards Hashem. He used the same element within this story here. And the Parashat does a comparison between Pinchas and Moshe, because he says Moshe also stopped the plague at the Chet Egel, at the golden calf. But the Parashat says that the Pinchas' action was much harder, because Pinchas actually stopped the plague once the plague was actually in progress. Because it says in verse 11, the Pinchas turned back my anger from Bnei Israel. In other words, Hashem's anger had already been leashed out of Bnei Israel, and the plague had started. And I guess the comparison between the two is being questioned, because when Moshe halted the plague after the golden calf, he was not reinstated to the state of priesthood as Pinchas was. Why was that? And the Asher suggests that because Moshe actually forfeited his right to become priest at the burning bush when he refused to take on the leadership of priesthood at that point. And because he had forfeited that, he did not regain it, the priesthood, after abating Hashem's wrath and halting the plague at that time. And the Alshar says there are four items that determine the value of an action like the one that Pinchas did. And the first one is the level of the person at the time and the circumstances. The second factor is the timing of the act. The third is the eagerness and the level of dedication with which you undertake that task. And the fourth is the final results. And in all those four criteria, Pinchas got 100%. And the real point here is that he didn't just kill a person, he actually saved the nation. And because he made peace between God and the Jewish people, he then got the reward of the covenant of peace by God. Because Pinchas saved the Jewish nation and kept them alive, he was rewarded by a rebirth, a new creation of Pinchas, a new essence of him. And it's fascinating, it's because it's precisely this rebirth that enabled him to become a priest. Because now, if you really consider it as a rebirth, he's reborn to Elazar after Elazar was a Kohen, so therefore Pinchas can become a Kohen as well. And not only that, but all his children underneath him. And so he gets awarded the covenant of peace, which is basically restoring peace and harmony between God and the Jewish people. And let's look at this for a moment. What does peace mean to you? It's clearly a resolution of two conflicting parties. And the most clear expression of that is the conflict between our body and the soul. You see, the soul is kind of forced to come down into the body against its will. And all it wants to do is go back to the holiness of its heavenly abode above. And in fact, the Alshar says that with every breath we make, the breath intake, the soul goes up, and the breath outtake, the soul comes down. He doesn't mean literally. He means that when we breathe in, it reminds the soul of where he came from and the holiness of that area. And when we breathe out, it reminds the soul of how low the soul has had to sink in its connection with the body. And so what stops the soul from going back up to heaven with every breath? And the Alshar says that were it not for the fact that the earth is full of the glory of Hashem, and this is what consoles the soul, because it thinks if that's the case, if God is made his abode here down below in this impure world, then if it's good enough for the master, it's good enough for the servant, meaning the soul. And so when Pinchas gets the covenant of peace, what it means is that there's no longer conflict between his soul and his body. And the only two other times when that was the case is Adam Harishon before the sin, and also Bnei Israel at Matan Torah before they did the sin of the golden calf. That means in a whole duration of nearly 6,000 years, there's only some 40 days and a few hours where that achievement of peace between the body and soul was established. And notice that when you do establish that peace, then there is no room for the Satan to come in. There is no influence that the Satan has, this angel of death has on the person. And so the consequence of all of this is that the covenant of peace of Pinchas meant that he lived forever. And that perhaps is why we are told that Pinchas is Eliyahu Navi. And Pinchas' new status of superhuman is reinforced by in Joshua 2, when we read about the two spies that Joshua sent into Jericho. One of them was Pinchas. And it's very interesting to read that Rachav took the two men and hid him instead of hitting them. This was because one of the two men was Pinchas, and seeing that he was totally a spiritual person, his body did not need hiding, since he was invisible to the Canaanites anyway. Again, when Pinchas, i.e. Eliyahu, Elijah, rose to heaven, we find that the search parties could not locate any of the remains of the bodies. That's in Kings 2, chapter 2, verse 2. So we see that both Moshe and Pinchas get this sort of superhuman status of their body. They manage to transform themselves. As we said earlier, when you do a mitzvah, you don't only collect the deeds, but you actually transform your personality. But they managed to transform their bodies to a spiritual level that it became super holy, and as a result had super holy characteristics. And now let's turn to chapter 25, verse 15. We are now told the name of this Midian woman, but we're still, with regards to Zimri, he's still referred to as the Israeli man. Ish Israel, which is actually a complementary term. So how can we give him a complementary term given that what he did? And the Alshech contrasts his fall in stature from an Israeli man to somebody who's slain with the Midianite woman. He compares that with the fact that the Midian woman is still called the daughter of Tzur, the head of the people of her father's house in Midian. And we have to understand why there's such a vicious retaliation for the Midianites versus the Moabites. I mean, after all, they both went about to seduce the Jewish people. And yet for the Midianites, we're told we should harass them and smite them because they harassed us. And we don't hear about that regarding the Moabites. To understand this, we have to go back to chapter 25, verse 1, when he says, Israel settled in Shittim, and then the people began to commit harlotry. So when it says Israel, it's talking about the elite. And when it says the people, Ha'am, it's talking about the more common people. So what happened was the Israel camped and settled in Shittim, but it was the more common people that were induced into harlotry through the daughters of Moab. And this was a fairly classic case of appealing to man's carnal instinct. The Moabite girls insisted on the Jewish men to bow down before their idols before benefiting from the physical delight of the food and the drink that they offered them. But the Midianites were much craftier. They were going for the elite of the Jewish people. In fact, they were going for Moshe and Eliezer. And their method was very cunning. They actually invited the Jewish people to defecate in front of their idol. And one would think that that would be a derogatory insult to their idols and so fairly harmless. But in fact, it was only when Israel engaged with the Midians that God's anger became flared. And in verse 18, where it says, Al Davar Cosby, on the matter of Cosby, the Alshech says that actually Cosby was told by her father to go for Moshe and Eliezer. When Zimri told her that he was as holy as they were, she decided, she changed her plan and went for him, thereby deviating from her father's instructions. And the big lesson for Moshe was that it's one single woman could completely destroy a nation, as Cosby tried to, but on the other hand, a single woman could save a nation, as the unborn Moabite Ruth would eventually save the Jewish nation through her son David. And straight after this incident in chapter 26, we see the recounting of the Jewish nation, which is very interesting to count at this point. And the Alshach says a number of points. Firstly, notice that when it comes to counting each of the tribes, for example, verse 7, it says, Eli mishpachot haruveni, with the hey in front and the yud at the end of the word Reuven. And this Yud and Hey is like a stamp of Hashem, guaranteeing that in spite of all that happened, the purity of the Jewish nation and its families and its tribes was kept intact. Not only that, it was very important to note that even though the 24,000 people died as a result of the plague, the total number of the Jewish people as a result of this count came up to 601,730, which is above the magic number of 600,000. In other words, the highest expression of the Shekhinah being present with the Jewish people can only happen when there's more than 600,000 people in the camp. And so this was a further vindication that God's connection with the Jewish people was intact even after this incident. And now let's turn towards the story of Moshe having to climb the mountain and see the land of Israel from the top. We're going to chapter 27, verse 12, and it says that Hashem said to Moshe, "Go up this mountain of Abarim and see the land that I've given to the children of Israel. You will see it, and you shall be gathered unto your people, you too, as Aaron your brother was gathered in, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin, in the assembly's strife to sanctify me at the water before their eyes." And apparently Moshe asked God that whenever the death of Moshe or Aaron was mentioned in the Torah, that it should be made clear that this was due to their sin in hitting the rock, and not as part of the general sin of the Jewish people, which required them to die in the desert. And it's for this reason that that the reason for their death is repeated. But the Alshach really brings to our attention this word gam ata, and you also. And here the Alshach is suggesting that in the same way that Moshe died with a kiss of God, as did Aaron and Miriam, there was a difference. The gam ata means that your body also will be elevated to the heavens as a result of the kiss. So we see that whereas both Miriam and Aaron were buried in the desert, Moshe's burial site is not known, because as a result of all that Moshe did, plus the 3 times that he went up to the mountains for 40 days, 120 days in total, meant that his body had transformed into a spiritual entity. And it's for this reason that the Jewish people noticed the beams of light emanating from his face. And as we said earlier, Moshe is the only person in the world who was perfectly comfortable amongst the heavens and amongst the earth. And I guess is the ultimate transformer of himself and his character through his life in this world. Not only refining his attributes, but also his body to the highest level of kedusha, of sanctity that a person could do. And whilst we may not all achieve that level of purity, it's something we should all strive for. And have a look at verse 15, where Moshe asks God to appoint a suitable successor for him. And it's the Alshach asks a very interesting question. We heard already in the previous parasha, Eldad and Medad prophesied that not only would Moshe die and Yoshua bring the people to the land of Israel. So in this question of Moshe to God to request that he appoint a suitable leader to take his place, invites 2 questions. Firstly, Was Moshe pretending that he didn't know that Yeshua was going to be the successor? And secondly, why is he giving God advice as to who to bring a successor in? And Moshe is saying that he wants a leader that will lead the Jewish people into battle and be the first to lead them in and the first to bring them back. And in verse 23 it says, Moshe placed his hands on Yeshua in front of the Jewish people. He placed both hands, with the right hand to hand over the religious authority and the left hand to hand over the temporal power of authority. And because Moshe placed both hands on Yeshua, Yeshua didn't actually need to consult the Urim and Turim when he was the leader of the Jewish people. He had that direct connection with God, as did Moshe. And then after that, we have the whole descriptions of all the korbanot for the festivals that we read on each festival. So that's it for Parashat Pinchas. I hope you enjoyed it. And I leave you with this blessing: to be conscious and grateful that the whole earth is filled with the glory of God, because had that not been the case, our souls would not stay around in our bodies. They would just fly back up to heaven. And that would be the end of us. So we should be grateful for God's glory in our midst. It brings a whole new light into the creation of the Mishkan, the house of Hashem on this world. And that's perhaps why we have 5 parashot explaining it. Because it's only when God occupies this level, this lower level of the world, that our souls can be consoled enough to stay in our bodies long enough for us to live to 120. Bezrat Hashem. And so what do we do with these beautiful years that God has given us? And the whole point of human existence is that we should take this precious gift of the body and, with the guidance of our soul, which is part of God's above, to refine ourselves, our characters and our bodies to the highest level of purity and holiness that we can achieve. And when we do that, the actual transition between this world and the next becomes as easy as pulling a hair out of a milk, as the Gemara describes. Wishing you Shabbat Shalom, take care, and see you next week.